I found my boat missing from the marina. Dad smirked. Your sister has a husband and kids. She needs it more than a single woman like you. I didn't argue. I just asked, did you tell her I sold it last week to the county sheriff? Dad went pale as I dialed the harbor patrol. The slip where my boat should have been sitting was empty, and for a few seconds I stood on the dock trying to convince myself I'd walked to the wrong row. I hadn't. Slip 14, Bell Harbor Marina, a few docks down from the fuel pump. I'd tied up there 6 years. The slip was empty, and I stood there a few seconds trying to convince myself I'd walked to the wrong row. I hadn't. The cleats were still bolted to the wood, and the shore power cord I'd left coiled by the piling hadn't moved. Gone was 22 feet of white fiberglass, bimini top, the chip in the port rail from a bad landing my second summer of owning her. It smelled like diesel and low tide, same as it always did that hour before the fuel dock got busy. A couple of gulls picked at something near the ladder of the empty slip, not bothering to look up. I'd cleared my whole Saturday for this. The movers weren't due for another few weeks, but my new schedule at Meridian was going to eat every weekend I had once training started, and I wanted one last look at the water before I became someone who fixed elevators 4 hours from the nearest marina. I'd pictured a quiet morning, grab my gear, wave at whoever the sheriff's office sent. Maybe coffee at the bait shop before driving home, not a trailer already backed down the ramp. For a second I figured the county had come early. I'd been told the pickup was scheduled for that afternoon, and I'd only come by to grab the tackle box and the cooler I'd forgotten, figuring I could catch the transfer crew before they left with her. Then it hit me that if it wasn't the county, somebody had stolen a boat that didn't even belong to me anymore, and my hands went cold on the rail thinking about explaining that to people whose whole job was boats. I had my phone halfway out of my jacket pocket when I heard my father's voice from 2 docks over, and I already knew this wasn't going to be about a stolen boat. He and my brother-in-law Andrew stood beside a boat trailer backed halfway down the public launch ramp. My boat, my former boat technically, though nobody there but me knew that yet, hung in slings from the marina's travel lift, 8 feet off the water, swinging a little with the wake off a passing trawler. A dockhand I recognized, a kid named Nate who usually worked the fuel dock, had his hand on the lift controls. He'd gone very still, eyes flicking between me and my father, like he'd just realized he might be in the middle of something he shouldn't be. Dad, I said it loud enough to carry over the diesel idle of the lift. What are you doing? He turned around with the boat still swinging behind him, and he gave me the same smile he always gave me whenever he'd already decided something and wanted me to catch up gracefully. Kara, good you're here. Saves me a phone call. You're loading my boat onto a trailer. Jill's boat, as of about 10 minutes from now. He said it easily, like he was telling me the weather. Andrew and I figured we'd surprise her. She's been wanting to get the kids out on the water for ages, and you've barely touched this thing since spring. I looked past him at Andrew, who at least had the decency not to quite meet my eyes, and then back at Nate. Nate, I said, who told you it was okay to pull my boat? Your dad had the gate code and a key that fit the cabin lock. Nate's hand came off the lift lever like it had gotten hot. He said you two had already talked about it. Said you knew he was coming. I hadn't talked to my father in 11 days, and the last conversation had been about my mother's birthday dinner, not my boat. He'd kept a spare key from back when he used to help me winterize her every fall. The first few years I owned the thing and didn't fully trust myself with the engine work. I hadn't thought about that key in a long time. Clearly he had. I did not know he was coming, I said. And it's not okay. My father's smile didn't waver. That was always the part that got to me. Not that he lied exactly, but that he never seemed to feel the need to defend a lie once it was caught. He just adjusted. Kara, be reasonable. You live alone in a 1-bedroom, you take this boat out maybe twice a summer, and you're about to move 4 hours away for a job. Jill's got a husband, 2 kids, a house with a driveway big enough to park it in. She needs it. You don't. You've never needed the things Jill needs, and I don't understand why every single time you have to make this harder than it has to be. None of what he'd just said was new. I'd heard some version of that sentence since I was 19 years old. When Jill got married at 23, my parents put a down payment on her first house because a young family starting out needed the help more than a single daughter renting an apartment did. When Jill had her first kid, they bought her a minivan outright and told me, when I asked, that I didn't have the same expenses she did, so it wouldn't be fair to give me the same thing. When Jill's second kid needed braces, my parents covered half, and when I needed a new transmission the year before, I got a lecture about budgeting instead. It was never framed as favoritism. It was framed as fairness. In our family, fairness meant the person with more got more, because she had more people depending on her, and the person with less was expected to be grateful she only had herself to worry about. A couple of Christmases ago, the pattern showed up again in miniature. My parents gave Jill's family a week at a rental cabin as a group gift and gave me a gift card because, in my mother's words that year, I could treat myself any weekend I wanted and didn't have anyone else to plan around. I'd stopped arguing about it years ago. Arguing had never once changed the outcome. It had only ever gotten me a lecture about my tone, and eventually I'd found other places to put my energy, mostly into building sets for the community playhouse 2 towns over, which is a large part of why the boat had gone from something I used most weekends to something I paid to store. I liked hammers and paint and plywood a lot more than I liked untangling a bilge pump, it turned out, and nobody had ever once suggested I didn't deserve the hobby because I lived alone. So I didn't argue now either. I stood on the dock with the lift motor idling and my boat hanging in the air between us, and I asked my father one question. "Did you tell Jill I sold it last week to the county sheriff's office?" I watched the color leave his face, something I'd never once seen happen to him before. Not even the time I told him I was moving out of state without asking his opinion first. His mouth opened, then didn't finish opening. "You're joking," he said finally. "I'm not." The boat wasn't leverage. It would be a better story if I'd planned it, if I'd sold it out of spite, waiting for exactly this moment to pull the rug out from under him. That's not what happened. I'd taken the job in Richmond because Meridian Elevator offered me a service contract lead position with better pay and a real path toward running my own crew, something I wasn't going to get staying put fixing the same aging elevators in Wickford for the rest of my career. Once the move was set, the boat stopped making sense on paper. I'd used her twice the entire previous summer, both times with a friend from the theater group rather than family. The slip fees, the insurance, the winterizing I'd now have to pay someone else to do since I wouldn't be around for it. None of it penciled out anymore for a boat I mostly just felt guilty about not using. I'd put a notice up on the marina's bulletin board and mentioned it to a few people at the fuel dock, one of whom happened to be a deputy from the Anders County Sheriff's Marine Unit who came by most Thursdays to gas up his patrol boat. Their unit had been trying for years to replace an aging rescue boat and hadn't gotten the funding for new, so a solid used hull that had been kept up properly was exactly what they needed. We signed the paperwork 9 days before this, at the sheriff's substation off the highway, and I'd been paid in full that same afternoon. The only reason the boat was still sitting in my slip at all was that the Marine unit hadn't had a crew free to send out for pickup until that day. None of it was a secret. It just hadn't occurred to me that my father would go looking for a boat that wasn't there to find, or that he'd have a way in if he did. "She's county property," I told him. "Has been for over a week. The transfer crew is coming this afternoon to take her to their dock at the substation. You just had a marina employee pull a rescue boat that belongs to the Anders County Sheriff's Office off its lift and load it onto your trailer." Andrew, who up to that point had said nothing, took a step back from the trailer like it had turned electric. "You said she knew," he said to my father, and his voice had a different register than my father's had, something closer to actual fear. "You told me she'd already agreed to it, that she just didn't want to be the one handing it over. You said." "I said we'd take care of it." My father cut him off, and for the first time his voice had an edge that wasn't performance. "Kara, tell them to put it back down." "I'm not telling anyone anything. I already had my phone out. I'm calling it in." I dialed the direct line the deputy had given me the day I signed the paperwork, the one for Marine Unit Dispatch, rather than the general non-emergency number, because I still had it saved from coordinating the pickup time. A woman answered on the second ring, and I told her what was happening in a few short sentences. My name, the slip number, that a boat the county had already purchased and paid for was currently hanging off the marina's travel lift and being loaded onto a private trailer by people who did not have authorization to remove it. She asked me to stay where I was and to keep everyone on scene if I safely could, because a Marine unit truck was already on its way for the scheduled pickup and could likely get there faster than a patrol car from town. He heard enough of that call to understand it was real, and he didn't try to leave. To his credit, or maybe just because Nate had already backed the lift away from the trailer the second I said the word sheriff, there wasn't really anywhere for him to go. The boat swung gently in the slings, out over open water, well out of reach of the trailer hitch now. "You could have just told them no," my father said while we waited. He'd recovered some of his composure, enough to sound aggrieved rather than caught. "You didn't have to call the police over a family disagreement. It stopped being a family disagreement when you used a key I didn't know you still had, to take property that isn't mine to give away." I kept my voice level, which took more effort than I expected. "You didn't ask me if Jill could have the boat. You didn't ask if I still had the boat. You decided, and then you found a way around the part where I might say no." He tried once more anyway. "You still could have called me the second you sold it, given me some warning instead of letting me find out like this." "You didn't give me any warning either," I said. "You gave me a done deal with a dockhand standing in as a witness. I'm allowed to do the exact same thing you did. Mine's just already legal." He didn't have an answer for that. He looked out at the water instead, at the boat swaying 8 feet above it, and I understood he wasn't thinking about what he'd done. He was thinking about what came next, which for my father had always been the only question that mattered. The Marine unit truck pulled into the marina lot 13 minutes later, ahead of schedule, followed shortly after by a patrol car from the county's general division that dispatch had sent as backup once the first call came in describing an attempted removal of department property. A pair of officers came down the dock, a deputy named Mercer, who I'd met once before during the sale, and a second officer I didn't recognize. Mercer looked at the boat still hanging in the lift, looked at the trailer back to the ramp, and looked at my father and Andrew standing next to it, and I watched him do the math out loud before he said a word. "This the vessel from the Bentley sale?" He asked me, and I confirmed it. He turned to my father. "Sir, can you explain what you and this gentleman were doing with a boat that belongs to Anders County?" He tried, at first, the version where it was all a misunderstanding. He'd believed I still owned it, hadn't known about the sale, was simply trying to surprise his other daughter with a gift. Mercer let him get about halfway through that before asking, evenly, how he'd gotten past the marina's gate and into the boat's cabin lock if he hadn't spoken to me recently and didn't know the vessel's current status. There wasn't a clean answer for that, because the truth was he'd used a key from years ago, specifically because he knew I hadn't gotten around to changing the locks. Nate confirmed, when asked, that my father had told him directly that he and I had already discussed the transfer. Mercer took my father and Andrew's statements separately, on opposite ends of the dock, which meant I got to watch the two of them try to keep their stories lined up from 30 feet apart without being able to actually talk to each other. Andrew's account came apart within a couple of questions. He admitted my father had told him on the drive over that he wasn't entirely sure I'd agreed to anything, but that it would be simpler to ask forgiveness once the boat was already sitting in Jill's driveway. Mercer wrote it all down without comment. That was the part that mattered legally, it turned out. Not the taking itself, which they never actually managed to complete, but the fact that my father had knowingly misrepresented his authority to a marina employee in order to gain access to county property. Mercer and the second officer took statements from everyone on the dock, including Nate, who looked increasingly ill as it became clear he'd been used without his knowledge to help move a law enforcement vessel off marina grounds. They photographed the boat, the trailer, the cabin lock, the slings. Mercer explained, once everyone had given their account, that because the boat hadn't actually left marina property and no damage had occurred, the county wasn't pursuing felony theft charges, but my father and Andrew were both being cited on the spot for attempted theft of government property, a misdemeanor that would still put them in front of a judge, with a fine attached and a record neither of them had had before that morning. He'd also be barred from Bell Harbor Marina going forward, per the marina's own policy once management learned what had happened with the gate code, regardless of whatever the sheriff's office decided to do with the criminal side of it. Andrew signed his citation without a word. He argued with Mercer for almost a full minute about whether any of this was really necessary, whether they couldn't just let it go given that nothing had actually been stolen, and Mercer told him, not unkindly, that the only reason nothing had been stolen was that I'd caught it in time and called it in, not because either of them had stopped on their own. He signed the citation after that, and didn't look at me while he did it. The Marine unit crew took the boat about 20 minutes later, once the officers had finished with everyone. I stood on the dock and watched her go up onto their trailer instead, and it should have felt strange, Watching 6 years of a boat I'd loved get hauled away behind a truck with a county emblem on the door, but mostly what I felt was relief that it hadn't gone the other way. I called Jill that night before my father could get to her with his own version of things first, because I didn't want her hearing about any of it secondhand or garbled by the time it reached her. It turned out I didn't need to worry about the order. Andrew had already called her from the marina parking lot before the officers had even finished with him and told her everything. The plan, the surprise, the citation, all of it. She called me 40 minutes after I would have called her, and the first thing she said was that she'd had no idea, none at all, that either of them had been planning this. She'd mentioned once, months earlier, in a completely ordinary conversation, that she wished the kids could spend more time on the water like we used to as kids ourselves. That offhand comment was the entire seed of it. He'd taken it and built a plan around it without saying a word to her first, because telling her in advance would have meant giving her the chance to say it was a bad idea, and Jill, to her credit, would have said exactly that. We talked for over an hour that night, longer than we usually managed even at holidays. Some of what she said surprised me enough that I wrote pieces of it down afterward, so I wouldn't lose them. She told me she'd started turning down help from our parents on principle a couple of years back, declining offers to cover summer camp or a new washer when hers broke, without ever mentioning it to me, because accepting always came with an unspoken bill paid later, usually in the form of me getting compared to her. I hadn't known any of that. I'd spent years assuming she either didn't notice the pattern or didn't mind it, and it turned out she'd been carrying her own version of the guilt the whole time, just somewhere I hadn't been able to see it. She was furious with both of them, angrier than I'd ever heard her before. Not the mild irritation she usually reserved for our father's decisions, but something closer to the anger I'd been carrying around on my own for most of a decade. She told me she was sorry, and she meant it, and she also told me something I hadn't fully understood until she said it out loud. That being the daughter who always got the extra help hadn't felt as good from the inside as I'd probably assumed it did from the outside. She'd spent years feeling like the family's charity case dressed up as its favorite, and she was tired of the story our father told about why she needed things and I didn't. That single conversation did more for our relationship than anything had in longer than I could remember. We talk most weeks now, without our father managing what each of us is allowed to know about the other. My father is a different matter. The citation went through the county court process over the following couple of months, and both he and Andrew ended up with fines and a diversion program that would clear the charge from their records if they stayed out of trouble for a year, which I understand they have. He never apologized to me directly for the key, the lock, or the lie he told Nate, and then tried again on Mercer. He called a couple of weeks after the court date, and for the first 10 seconds or so I actually thought he might say something real. What I got instead was, "You really embarrassed this family, you know that. Getting deputies involved in front of that Marina kid, like we're criminals." "You are, technically," I told him. "Cited for a misdemeanor, which you signed." He didn't have anything to say back to that, and the call didn't last much longer. What I got that day, in place of an actual apology, was a complaint that I'd embarrassed the family by getting law enforcement involved over what he still insisted on calling a misunderstanding. I told him I loved him, and that I wasn't going to pretend the last several years away, and that if he wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would have to start with him admitting what he actually did instead of what he wished I'd let him get away with. He hasn't done that yet. We speak occasionally, briefly, mostly around holidays, and I've stopped expecting more than that from him. My mother, for her part, told me privately that she'd warned him keeping that key around was a bad idea, though she waited until well after the fact to say so, which tells you most of what you need to know about how conversations go in that house. I moved to Richmond 3 weeks after all of it, into an apartment with no water view and no slip fees, and I started the new position at Meridian with a clean sense of having left something behind that had actually needed leaving. I found a small community theater within a month, and I'm already building sets for their winter show. The group is smaller than the one back in Wickford, held together by about a dozen regulars who build everything out of scrap lumber and enormous amounts of coffee, run this season by a retired schoolteacher who manages the crew like she's still got a classroom to keep in line, in the best possible way. It isn't the water. It's close enough. Sometimes on shift, I think about that boat sitting at the county substation dock now, doing the job it's supposed to do, finally getting the use I always meant to give her and mostly didn't. I don't feel the loss I expected to feel. Jill and the kids came down to visit 2 weekends ago, our first trip together without our father orchestrating who owed what to whom, and we spent an afternoon at a public dock near my apartment watching other people's boats come and go instead of missing my own. She asked at one point if I regretted selling it. I told her the truth. The only part I'd regret was if I'd kept it out of spite instead of practicality, and let it rot in a slip I couldn't justify anymore, just to have something to hand my father when he finally asked. I feel like something finally landed exactly where it needed to.